Reinvention is the action or process of changing something or someone so much that they're considered to be practically new. Generating a new lease on life is something that comes naturally and routinely to Dr. Candace Campbell. She's an award-winning actor, author, filmmaker, and nurse. Her background in nursing includes clinical, academic, and administrative posts. As a professional actor, she's appeared in radio, TV, film, the stage, and the internet. She was also the co-founder of an improv and stand-up comedy group in the mid-90s in the San Francisco Bay Area, which led to 3 solo shows, including An Evening with Florence Nightingale, a reluctant celebrity, which has played to rave reviews in 3 countries thus far. This multi-talented actor and dedicated healthcare professional joined me this week to have a discussion about her multifaceted career, her time in healthcare, diversity in show business, and so much more. Are you ready for a thought-provoking and consequential conversation? I know I am. So without further delay, I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. So, Candace, if you're ready, I'll take a moment to welcome you to the program, and I'm excited to dive into your extensive and vast career. Great to be with you this afternoon, and thank you so very much for being here.
My pleasure, Kevin.
So, Candace, I know that you started your career as a nurse, and then you've sort of pivoted into improv and everything in between. So I'm wondering if we could start our conversation by you giving me sort of a 360-degree view of your life and how you got to where you are today.
I'm happy to do that. Well, actually, what you just said about the chronology is what a lot of people suppose, but it's actually backwards. My my first degree is in acting, speech theater with an emphasis in acting. And I was on the road, I thought, to be a repertory actor. And life sort of, had a different way of, my path got derailed. Let me just say, after I graduated from college, I got cast in some summer stock. It's an old Neil Simon play, very funny, and I was the lead. It was called Barefoot in the Park. They made it into a movie. Of course, they spiced it up a bit in the movie, but the stage play is very funny, rated, family rated and everything. But anyway, I had what today's phraseology would be, I guess, a Me Too moment, when the director basically got me alone, and I thought I knew him, but I didn't know he was going through some sort of midlife crisis, and he tried to force himself on me. And I freaked out and shoved him across the room and said, "What in the world are you doing? I mean, this is a person, I used to babysit his kids." So I was just agog. I had no idea what this was all about. And he said, "You're going to New York. This is basically the way the game is played, don't you know?" And I said, "Not for me." And so I said, I quit. And he said, you can't quit. We're opening in 3.5 weeks. I said, watch me. And I didn't act again for about 10 years. And then I didn't know what to do, and went home with my tail between my legs. And my mother came in with a newspaper one day and said, look at this. Here's an ad. Pan Am is coming to town. And your Uncle Gus, when he took you up in the airplane, said that you dealt with the bumps and everything. You'd be a great stewardess. So why don't you go interview? And that's what I did for the next 5 years. I flew all over the world. And I call it my longest running acting gig. You know, costume, makeup. And it was great education. I studied dialects. And then later on in life, when I got a commercial agent, you know, I did a lot of voiceovers. That's how I got into AFTRA and then SAG, is by doing the commercial things. And anyway, while I was on the airplane one day, I'd been flying about 4 years, and I got what I call the call to be a nurse. Have you ever heard of anybody talk about that?
Like a call, like in terms of following your passion? I'm wondering if you can explain what do you mean by
Yes,
that?
yes. Well, I knew from early times when I was a little girl that I thought I'd like to be a nurse. But when I got to high school and my counselor said, well, let's look at your grades in math and science. And they weren't, you know, B's and C's. She said, I don't think you're going to be doing well in nursing school if you've got B's and C's. So I went off in the, you know, the other direction. I thought I would probably be a teacher at that point. But at any rate, I experienced, along with many other people that day, we were going from New Delhi to Karachi, Pakistan. And we were on a 747. And I was in the rear of the airplane, serving the rear of the airplane with another flight attendant. And when we had served the meal, and by the way, I just flew again. And I'm old school, you know, we used to serve a hot meal, chicken, steak, or fish with a dessert, etc., for everyone. So anyway, there we were, and the air conditioning wasn't working very well on the airplane. And we had just served a very large meal, and my section in the back was 124 people. And then we hit turbulence.
Oh dear.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. So we were told to take our seats, and we had a ringside view of 124 people vomiting in unison.
Oh my.
Yeah, Kevin, there were ribbons of vomit. And that day I got the call, as I say, because I realized I wanted to help them. And there are two types of people in the world, is what I realized. Those that go to run to help and those that run to hide. And she ran to hide and I ran to help. And afterwards, she said, oh my gosh, I don't know how you did that. It made me sick to even, geez, it was terrible. Well, first of all, you have to know, Kevin, that in the day, we also had blankets up top. So I had just taken the blankets out, covering the yuck, breathing through my nose, and told her that. And then I said to her, you know, if it wasn't so sad that everybody was sick, it was kind of artistic, you know, ribbons of vomit. And she said, you have that sick sense of humor. You should be a nurse. So I became a nurse.
Ah, well, I tell you, that is certainly an encyclopedia of a story, isn't it? And I'm curious, based on your time in show business and as a nurse. I'm curious how you view today's society with healthcare workers and the important role they've played getting us through the pandemic, and how you think comedy can help us all get through this time.
Well, that's a multifaceted question, I think. But let me say this about that. In my time as a nurse, and I call it my crazy quilt of nursing, because I started in behavioral health and was at the VA in LA, and then I transitioned. I've done labor and delivery in the NICU, home health. I've done a lot of things, ER, and then I became an administrator and then an academic. And I'm saying that because I think that I do have kind of an overall view of the problems that are inherent in healthcare. And what we're seeing in the pandemic is just an extension of what those of us who are nurses and doctors have been saying for over 20 years, Kevin. Healthcare in this country, well, in all countries, let's face it, we're human, we have institutions, they're imperfect. There's no perfect healthcare situation. And I know this because I lived in 5 other countries, and even the national health is no better. In fact, I think it's worse in a lot of cases. But you asked about the pandemic, and obviously it's impacted the staffing levels in many ways, because nurses who are trained for one thing have been duty bound to rush into the fray and help in areas where they weren't really, they weren't trained, or let's put it this way, they hadn't been in those areas for a long time, you know, like people who were pediatric nurses running up to ICU and dealing with adults. It's not that they didn't know how, because everybody's trained the same way in nursing school. But, you know, Kevin, what you're familiar with, where things are, the sorts of equipment, and more specifically, the kinds of cases that you're dealing with will add to that. The fact that nobody knew what the heck to, you know, the doctors were doing their best to figure out how to deal with this severe illness. And you've read the reports, a lot of what they were doing didn't really help. So there was a lot of what we call burnout. It's moral distress in watching so many people die. A lot of nurses who were over 50, and oh, by the way, I don't know if you know this, it's not always said in the media, that before the pandemic, the average age, the mean age of a nurse is 52. So how do you think that impact? Well, obviously, they're leaving the field or changing, you know, going into something else. And it's really devastating. It's a big, big problem right now that we have going forward. Plus, one last thing, the fact that in order to train up new nurses, we need nurses like myself who have a doctorate degree. It's a lot of time, it's a lot of effort, it's a lot of money. And guess what? Once you get to be a professor, you get about half the pay.
And just how did Campbell come up with the idea and the motivation for this entertaining and informative solo third act? She took some time out to explain the process of how she brought one of the most influential women in history to life.
Okay, well, first of all, if I might, let me just say it's my 3rd solo show, and that obviously I got back into acting, but it wasn't until after I went through a divorce and moved to the San Francisco area from a small town where I could get where I had a commercial agent and so forth. So I got back into acting. Well, then sometime pretty soon after the divorce, you know something, Kevin, if you've been through a life crisis, and that was something that was very difficult for me. I had 3 children, and it was going back to work, you know, full time. Thank God I am a nurse, so I had, you know, a way to make some money for us. Um, what happened is that I just needed to laugh again. You know, when you've been down so long, kind of like the
Yeah,
pandemic.
that's important. Laughter is very important, isn't it?
Yeah. So what I did, I answered an ad for a comedy class, and I started taking stand-up comedy lessons. And I met some other people, and we all at the same time started also learning improv, which had not been formally taught to me as an acting student because I'm old, and it was only just the books were only just coming out in the 70s when I already graduated, you know? So I learned that art form, and 4 of us peeled off from the stand-up comedy classes and started our own improv company there in the San Francisco area. So all that to say, we were together for about 3 years, and that's how I started teaching improv and continue to teach improv. And that's, you know, some of the books that are up there. But in the meantime, when the group sort of closed down, you know, these theatrical groups, one guy moved away and another guy, you know, did something else. And anyway, that's how I got sort of motivated for the first solo show, because we had pitched and gotten a gig with one of my professional nurses associations. So I did the first show, and then there were some other things that were going on in my mind. So I did a second show, and I did not have in mind to do a third show. It's a lot of work. And although, you know, writing the music and things like that got me into ASCAP, that was good. But it wasn't on my radar as something I was going to do, because when I started reading the works of Nightingale, I was still in grad school. And let me tell you, that happened in 2010. Um, I don't know if you know this, but in 2010, that happened to be the 100th year anniversary of Florence Nightingale's death. Kind of a weird thing to celebrate. But I was in a faculty meeting, and the librarian came in and said, "Did you all know that there's been a great collaboration with the British people who have all of these items of Florence Nightingale's?" She wrote over 200 books and articles, and we have over 14,000 of her letters, and they're digitized now, and they're in the library. So I started reading, and what I found was a kindred spirit. You know, they didn't have telephones, and I don't know, people nowadays, we don't think of the post office as being such a big deal for communication because we've got the internet. But in her day, the London Post was delivered 4 times a day.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen anymore.
No, but I mean, it was the equivalent of calling somebody up. You know, you'd send, okay, well, come to tea and this and that. And so that's why we have so many of her letters. People kept on to them because she became quite famous after she came back from the Crimean conflict. And she, you know, she was such an innovator. She spoke 6 languages fluently. She was an ad hoc advisor to the people in all of the British colonies and so forth on sanitation and those other, you know, issues. So that's why it happened. And I suppose, let me backtrack. That's not exactly why it happened in terms of the show. The reason why I decided to do the show is because a friend of mine from the National Speakers Association heard me going on and on and on about this in about 2013. And he said, now, wait a minute, let me get this straight. You are a nurse, yes, and you are an actor, yes, and you've had 2 solo shows, yes. Then why, he said, isn't this your 3rd show? And I went, oh, that's a lot of work. And I just already finished a doctorate. But, you know,
I can totally understand. Absolutely. We've got to value our time and make our priorities work for us, right? So I'm glad that you've decided to explore your creative side and bring a little bit of happiness to a lot of people about exciting time in history, for sure.
well, there are a lot of lessons to be learned. And thank you. Yes, yes. Like I said, she's an amazing person who actually, a lot of people don't know, although she never spoke in public, women didn't then, although she never went to university because she wasn't allowed. Her father, brought tutors and so forth. She is the first woman to be inducted into the Royal Society of Statisticians, and thereafter the others. And she is among, and anytime you look at a list of famous women in history, she's always on that list, right up there with Cleopatra, because she is, in a way, a poster child for women's liberation. Although she would never have marched or, thrown eggs at anybody or anything like that. But she wrote about it consistently to change Victorian England.
Yeah, she's a consequential and important piece of the story of history, for sure. But I'm also curious to ask you about sort of your tagline of blending art and science for positive change. And I'm wondering if you can tell me about that motto a little bit.
Yes, that's, when people meet me or have met me, and many times they're very surprised that a person who was an actor got the call to be a nurse. But when I started studying nursing, I saw immediately that there's a parallel, because as I used to tell my students, we're working in the theater of the real. We go into a hospital room or wherever, if we're in home nursing, we're walking in through a doorway. It might as well be going from backstage onto the stage. We know a little bit of the story of the person, of why they are where they are, similar to how an actor knows the script, the story of what they're going to enact. But it's very much improvisation, because although we have a theme or we have a bit of a template, we as nurses, we know the process, the clinical pathway of care that we're going to be embarking on. Every case is different, every person is different, and their families are different. And when well, I don't know, Kevin, if you or your family have ever been a patient, that when your nurse comes in the room, if they're keyed into you, it makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Campbell, I was born with what's called spastic quadriplegia cerebral palsy. So I've spent my fair of time in a hospital room, and I have to tell you that I value nurses and healthcare professionals more than most people, for sure.
I appreciate that. Yes. And I used to tell my students, if you give yourself over to the understanding that it's not about you. There's no reason for you to be nervous when you go in the room. It's all about them. You're going to be there to help ease the pain or make things better, and just be yourself, and you know it'll happen. So the exercises that I teach when I do workshops or sometimes I do one-on-one coaching with especially leaders, if they've got to if they're tasked with giving speeches, or even if they're a leader and they're a new leader and the team is kind of disjointed, the improvisational exercises, when they're applied in this certain way, they're very helpful to bring people together, to establish relationships, and then creatively problem solve, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dr. Campbell, I'm wondering for you, whether it be your personal or professional life, I'm wondering for you, what brings you the most fulfillment individually?
Oh my goodness. I was just thinking about that. As I mentioned before, I just got back from probably the largest nurses conference possibly in the world, the American Nurses Association. We were in Atlanta, and there were close to 7,000 nurses, and I performed as Nightingale there. And that is wonderful because I kind of feel like my book, the title of this book back here is Channeling Florence Nightingale, Integrity, Insight, Innovation, which is all based on her writings. And I, as an actor, I very much step into that. And I was giving a greeting and speaking to the nurses as I know she would today. She'd be so proud of them, etc. And that gives me great personal satisfaction. However, I will tell you something that I discovered when I started teaching applied improvisational exercises there in the San Francisco area to Silicon Valley businesses. Were the first people who hired me because they saw what we were doing on stage was spontaneously problem solving. I learned the very first time I did one of those workshops that seeing people create relationships and seeing them change, that to me was more fulfilling than any standing ovation.
Yeah, helping and seeing other people reach their fullest potential is always important, isn't it?
Yeah.
And Dr. Campbell, I'm curious for you, what does the notion of inclusion and diversity look like for you, both in life, healthcare, and acting? I'm curious.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I was thinking about that just this last weekend when I was doing some research before I did another keynote to these nurses on improvisation and how it could be applied in healthcare to to well, we call it tear down walls and build bridges in healthcare. And I came across an article that came out at the end of September. If you're familiar with the company called Press Ganey, it's a survey company. And they surveyed millennials. And the headline of the press release was something about why or what millennials think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they were targeting nurses and other healthcare people who happen to be millennials. And just, it was a large survey about their thoughts. And the thing that was surprising according to the report, to them, was also surprising to me. And here it was. Diversity and equity are, of course, important, especially if you're in a minority. But the thing that was common to all of the survey the surveyed people, and there was a large number of people surveyed of all stripes, was that inclusion was the most pressing and difficult problem that they found in healthcare. And here's how they defined it. They didn't feel a sense of belonging. And that, my friend, is exactly why I love teaching improv workshops, because we break down the barriers and everybody's the same as we play together. And we know that at work, in healthcare is 2 or 3 shifts, and you don't necessarily work directly with that person. Sort of indirectly is what I'm going to say, because each one of you has a caseload, and you're all getting medications and doing treatments and all of this, and you sort of pass each other and and sometimes help each other. But within that work environment, if you're new, there are a lot of travel nurses right now because they're going to where the need is the most. There's sometimes a very little orientation, and the orientation is more about, this is where the clean supplies are, and this is where you put the dirty things, and this is, it's a physical thing, and this is your director, who you'll never see again for a long time. They're in their office somewhere. But an orientation to the culture of, this is how we work things, this is how we work out our breaks, or this is how we do this or that, or here's so and so, and here's another person. Yeah, you only get their names on a fly sometimes. It's very difficult. And when you don't feel like you belong, can you imagine what it's like to go to work and have nobody really ask you about your weekend, or get to
Yeah,
know?
yeah, absolutely. Dr. Campbell, one of the models I live my life by is that inclusion is the gateway to independence, because I think that we all should be entitled to a platform to express our own individual stories. So,
Exactly. And you want in being in community, that's,
absolutely, that's very important.
yeah.
And I'm going to combine my last 2 questions because I think they're interconnected, and I know you have some thoughts on how we can establish better emotional intelligence. And also, Dr. Campbell, I'm wondering if you've given any thought on how you want your personal and professional legacy to be defined.
Ah, well, yes, emotional intelligence is divided. If you look at what the tenets are, it's divided up into basically 4 different quadrants, I believe, maybe it's 5. But we touch on those things when we're talking about improv, because the first one is to know yourself and be self-aware. That leads to self-confidence. And if you're a person in the workplace, most of us are not shy around our family, but when we get to work, there's so many reasons why we might be a little reticent, holding back a little bit. Maybe we're not the first person to reach out and connect with someone. Maybe we find it a little harder to do that. Then sometimes in the workplace, there's a lot of you who are in that situation, and when nobody reaches out, that can be a problem. So the way we teach these skills is very much the way actors learn to interpret a role, to step into the shoes of someone else. We touch on nonverbal communications, on being able to read somebody's face and their body language and what that means in terms of tone of voice and emotions that come out. All of these things in order to take what you think and be able to mirror that and express something, have a conversation starting with another person, which is the beginning. First of all, you have to know who you are, where you are in your space. And in terms of healthcare, that sometimes is like when you go into the room, you say you've been a patient. So You probably remember some nurse might have come into the room and looked at you, or maybe they're only looking at their chart. And maybe if there's family members around, they never engaged with those family members. It's very insulting.
Hmm.
But a lot of people are so in their head, they don't realize that. So in terms of my legacy, there are two things. I would very much hope that with my work, we are tearing down walls, those silos in healthcare, and building bridges with these tools. And that also the legacy of Florence Nightingale will live on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly a noteworthy worthy legacy. And finally, Dr. Campbell, I'm curious if people want to get connected with you, what's the best way they can do that?
Oh, thank you. I have two websites, so if they're interested, well, of course, you can always find me on LinkedIn. That's the most often that I am on social media is LinkedIn. But if they're interested in the Nightingale Show and want to see some videos of that, the website is florencenightingalelive.com. And then if they're interested in the improv and those sorts of things and some of my books and film, that's candycampbell.com.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Campbell, I really enjoyed spending a few minutes with you talking about your career and life in both acting, healthcare, and improv. Your time and energy on my behalf is most appreciated. And I want to thank you for being here. It's most appreciated.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Kevin.